Hey everybody, welcome to Not Being Governed on the Voluntary Virtues Network. Every Sunday from 3 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm the host, Daniel Hawkins. You guys might have read some of my stuff or seen me around Facebook, but to introduce myself, I'm a voluntarist, market anarchist, agorist, whatever, all that stuff, ANCAP, I guess. That's a controversial thing, whatever. I consider myself that, so whatever. I've written a few things here and there. This show is associated with, and is pretty much, I guess, the vodcast form or something of The Art of Not Being Governed. You've probably seen them on Facebook. If not, go over there and like them. They have the blog, notbeinggoverned.com. I've written the Anarchy Never Been Tried series over there that, is like a 6-part series on past anarchist societies which have existed, even though most people think they haven't. And I have written the article, Freedom is Unconstitutional. You might have read that. I'm also involved with a number of other things, the associated pages with them. I'm also involved with a separate project called the Turncoat Resource. Definitely do check them out if you haven't yet at turncoatresource.com. They're basically a blog. They're over at WordPress, I think, or whatever. But yeah, turncoatresource.com. It's got articles, essays, what have you, but it's also got something that I personally haven't ever seen voluntarists do so far. There's not a place for them to do, which is it's got poetry and art and things like that. So definitely do check them out. So an introduction to the show and what it'll be about. Probably just going to be covering like current events, news and stuff as it relates to voluntarism and anarcho-capitalism and all that. Probably going to be talking about different, ideologies and things like that. But I'm probably not going to spend too much time going over the basic points or tenets of anarcho-capitalism and voluntarism and all that. So if you're new to the philosophy, if you're new to this whole thing, I would definitely recommend reading up on it. Go to the Mises Institute, read up on it there. They've got tons of free PDFs. And do watch the other shows on the Voluntary Virtues Network. If you're brand new to it, or if you've been here for years, definitely check their shows out. But I'm not going to spend too much time going over it, because if you're watching this, chances are you're already at least a little bit familiar with everything. So I'm just going to go right into it. You guys will have to bear with me, because I've got kind of a basic setup here, not a fancy studio or anything, just, headphones with a microphone and a light over here. So, yeah, that's about it. So, today's episode, I'm going to be talking about kind of the recent, controversies surrounding the rise of what some people call the far right in Europe, and the different, some people call them fascist, neo-Nazi, racist, ethnocentric, Eurocentric parties in pretty much all over Europe. And there are plenty of them. So let me kind of preface it by saying that if you're unfamiliar with this, that's totally okay. I wasn't really familiar with it until pretty recently, that this whole thing was actually a pretty big deal. And also, I'm American. I'm sure a lot of our viewers are American. And if you were educated here, especially in the public school system, you probably don't know that much about foreign politics or the rest of the world in general. So definitely not blaming you in that aspect. But to give you a quick rundown, there is an article that I'm pulling from on Huffington Post on their politics page by Jessica Elgott or Elgo. I don't know how to say that. I'm sorry. Called European Elections, the 9 Scariest Far-Right Parties Now in the European Parliament. You've got Front National in France, or some people call it the National Front, whatever. Definitely a very controversial party in Europe right now. The National Democratic Party in Germany, and there are actually a lot of different parties in Germany that are associated with Neo-Nazism and that kind of thing. You've got Golden Dawn in Greece. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of them. The Finns, who used to be called the True Finns in Finland. The Danish People's Party. The Dutch Party for Freedom. That's definitely interesting. In Hungary, I don't speak Magyar or whatever, so forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but it's Jobbik or Jobbik, I think. It's far-right party in Hungary. And then you've got the Austrian Freedom Party. In Italy, you've got the Lega Nord. In Britain, you've got the British National Party and other parties in England. Got the whole Britain First movement. And then Vice has an article by Gavin Haynes called What is the Most Racist Country in Europe? Don't necessarily talk about parties, but they do talk about just the racist culture there. That's kind of on the rise. And then Adam Kokesh, who, if you're not familiar with him, definitely get familiar with him. He's one of my favorite libertarian personalities out there, and I would highly, highly recommend watching him. And he's got a new book coming out, so that's pretty cool. He recently did an interview talking about this party. I want to say it's called the Swedish Democrats, but, don't quote me on that. Or the Swedish Democratic Party or something like that. That's essentially a ethnocentric, Eurocentric party in Sweden. So, to kind of go over the history of this whole movement, they've definitely been around since about the 70s, is I think really when these parties began to bud. Coming off of World War II, you had a lot of Marxist communist movements going on in like South America, even like Africa, definitely Asia. So a lot of communism and Marxism spreading through Eastern Europe, obviously, and threatening Greece and Italy, and threatening obviously West Germany. So there was kind of this pushback by Europeans in the 70s, just during the Cold War, from the right wing, I guess, is what people would say. And I definitely want to dispel anything. I don't believe that there is even such a thing as a right or a left wing, neither do most voluntarists out there. So when I say right wing, take that with a grain of salt, especially because these parties have more what we would consider in America left-wing, I guess, economic platforms. Definitely pro-welfare, that kind of thing. So, and not, a lot of them aren't necessarily for war so much as just expelling certain ethnicities and races, which would definitely require violence, but a lot of them aren't talking a lot about invading other places or anything like that. So, not really accurate to even say right wing to begin with. It's not totally accurate to say fascist because a lot of them aren't for the fascist economic model, which in the United States we tend to call corporatism, or crony capitalism, or state capitalism, whatever you have it. So really the most accurate thing to call them would be nationalist. In Europe, that has a different meaning, I guess. Nationalist, or national in Europe, generally has a meaning that has to do more with secession, which is something that libertarians like me support. Seceding from the European Union, seceding from the countries that they're already part of, you know. So they're not nationalist in that sense, but they're nationalist in the sense of like patriotism. Some people would say ultra-patriotism, whatever. I definitely, as an anarchist, don't see a difference between patriotism and nationalism. But minarchists and conservatives would definitely disagree on that point, but whatever. Nationalist is probably the best way to describe them. Yeah, some of them have been around for a while. I know for sure that the Lega Nord has been around for a while. Yeah, so they kind of rose to combat communism and socialism and this idea of, you know, globalism and unification. And definitely they did not like the idea of unifying European countries, necessarily. A lot of them are very anti-Slavic, but then you do have Slavic countries that do themselves have a lot of nationalist and racist parties. So it used to be more of a thing to do with ethnocentrism, especially Germanic ethnocentrism, what you and I would probably call Neo-Nazism. That's definitely still present in a lot of these parties, but you also have more of a rise recently of what a lot of people call Eurocentrism, which means European unity, European nationalism, I guess, where they're trying to encourage and grow the sense of a European identity as opposed to a Aryan or German identity. So in that sense, they're not really neo-Nazis. So that pretty much covers the history. Their ideology, basically, a lot of them are opposed to communism, definitely opposed to anarchism, definitely opposed to Anarcho-Capitalism, opposed to, capitalism in general. So in that sense, I guess they would be considered far right wing. But they are very much concerned with the influx. I guess it's no longer an influx. In the 90s, it would have probably been considered an influx, but the whole concept of Muslim immigrants especially, but immigrants from outside Europe, very concerned about that. A lot of them draw on the idea that they don't want to give welfare to immigrants. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So they're like, hey, these people coming in from Turkey and Iraq and Pakistan and Palestine and North Africa or wherever, they don't want to give them welfare. They want it for Europeans because they believe that that's who deserves it. They're okay with welfare, they just don't want it going to immigrants. So that's just basically a taste of how totally insane these people are. Sorry. So they are opposed to pretty much all non-European immigrants, and a lot of them are opposed to certain types of Europeans, definitely the Romani, who are generally called gypsies, definitely opposed to Basque, who are also basically gypsies, opposed to those types of minority groups, that they don't consider European necessarily, or part of the European community. But a lot of the hatred toward Muslim immigrants and even Indian and Southeast Asian immigrants comes from what's been happening, where these immigrants will, and we've seen this in the United States, and we've had this type of culture. It was very prevalent in the turn of the century, around 1900, where a lot of immigrants would move in to these sort of poor neighborhoods, because a lot of them didn't start out with a lot of money, obviously. So they would move into these kind of ghetto areas and then kind of create these close-knit groups between people who shared their culture. Then the people that were already living there weren't usually entirely welcoming of them, so they kind of turn inward. And instead of assimilating, they kind of, I guess, grew more close together. And some of them didn't want to assimilate, but in the United States, that just wasn't really true. There were a lot of immigrants who came to the U.S. who really did want to assimilate. They may not have for a while, but there were a lot of them who did want to assimilate or were forced to assimilate. Obviously, we had a lot of people who came here and changed their names. Chances are you have a family member, maybe pretty closely related to you, who changed their last name, or even their first name, after moving here. So, sometimes that was a good thing for them, sometimes that was a bad thing for them. And a lot of these people coming in from the Middle East, India, Asia, a lot of Africa, like Somalia and stuff, coming into Europe, don't really feel welcome, especially after seeing a lot of these really, really, racist, basically, parties in the European Parliament are like, oh man, maybe we moved to the wrong place. So they get into these neighborhoods, and then they kind of create their own communities. They may not learn to speak the language that's already spoken there. They may stick to their native language. They may stick to their own traditions, which is, I think, a good thing, I guess. Keeping your traditions alive, I think, is a pretty, neat thing, but I'm also definitely for a fluid concept of culture. I don't necessarily believe that culture as we understand it even exists, but it's kind of for a different show, I guess. Anyway, the point is, they don't feel welcome. They form these really tight-knit groups. The Europeans feel like they're being rude or something, so it just creates this cycle of distrust toward one another. And then these parties that I'm talking about definitely capitalize on that and say, these people are strange, they're foreign, they don't want to be part of our culture, so, kick them out, or kill them even. Which is definitely a shame, I think. And there are a lot of Europeans who are ashamed of this. Don't get me wrong, I am not trying to lump Europeans into this group. In fact, most Europeans probably hate these groups. To the point where they will advocate legislation banning these groups, which I think would totally be counterproductive. So yeah, and there's definitely a lot of backlash. There is backlash from Muslim immigrants, especially you see in like London and France and stuff. There is backlash from these immigrants saying, hey, we're Muslim and proud, and even some of them are fundamentalist, so they might get violent, and it's happened, it has. I'm not going to pretend like it hasn't happened. They might get violent toward Europeans. And then you also have anarcho-communists and statist communists who get violent toward these fascist groups, and the violence just kind of continues. So that definitely has happened. That happened when the US and NATO got involved in Italy and Greece. Definitely look up, if you haven't heard of it, something called Operation Gladio. That's Gladio, which is Italian and I think Latin for dagger, which was basically a false flag operation to discredit the communists by hiring fascist groups and infiltrating fascist groups and committing terrorism, basically. Something that we in the United States should note is that terrorism in Europe isn't really a rare thing. To us, it is, definitely. There, not so much. In Italy, I know for sure, and a lot of other places, they're actually kind of used to political violence. Car bombs, Ireland is definitely used to it. Car bombs, assassinations, broad daylight shootings, blowing up people's houses. That used to be a pretty regular occurrence, especially in the 80s. So, we're very sensitive to that kind of thing here, with good reason, but they are way more used to it, unfortunately. So, just some perspective there, I guess. And political violence in this type of thing happens. That's basically what the point of this video is that I wanted to make, is that all of this grows out of politics. That's why it's called political violence. And it's nothing unique to Europe, even though this type of ideology is definitely scary, given what we know about history, with Hitler and Mussolini. There's good reason to say, stay away from these guys. But advocating legislation as a solution to this is definitely not the right answer. Because you're going to get, even if you have another party, an opposing party, or movement, or political movement, or whatever, to these fascist groups, they have their own intentions, and they have their own agendas. And there's going to be somebody that is using it for those means, or for those ends, So, like in World War II, the mafia helped out the United States in combating fascism in Italy. Then they wanted something back. And it's happened in Iraq right now. We have the whole civil war going on because in politics, one side has control, then they oppress the minority. Then that group becomes in control, they become the majority, and then they oppress the minority. And it's happened in Rwanda, it's happened in Jamaica, it's happened in Nicaragua, Vietnam. It happens all over the world. So definitely be cautious of that. And a lot of it has to do with people wanting to gain that, seat of power. They want to be able to control how people live, basically. These racist parties are parties for a reason. They're not like biker gangs, prison gangs. These are people who want positions in politics. And they want these positions in politics because that gives them a lot of power. It gives them way more power than a biker gang or a street gang or a prison gang is ever going to have. Those gangs depend on people to join them. They might have control over a certain area, but they won't have legal control. They're always going to be competing with the police and that kind of thing. If one of these parties gains power in even just a local, even just a town, let alone all of Europe, if they do gain enough power, they're going to use it. People talk about abuse of power. Political power is abuse by its definition. You are abusing the people who oppose you because they happen to be born in that place. So, excuse me. So, that's what you're doing. By taxing them, by forcing them to obey your laws, all of that. It doesn't matter how democratic your country is. A lot of these European countries have like 20 parties, and you can vote for them a lot of times. You can vote for like 5 parties with separate offices if you don't like one of them entirely. So I guess that's kind of a good thing, but honestly it just breeds even more enmity between people. And either way, whatever party's in charge, or whatever party holds some sort of office, they're going to use the capacity that they have through legislation and through, the legitimized, belief in their authority. They're going to use the police, they're going to use the military, they're going to use, their version of the IRS, at their disposal to carry out their agenda. Doesn't matter if it's a communist in charge, or a Nazi in charge, or a liberal Democrat, as they would call them, pro-Western, I guess, pro-freedom, I guess, whatever, person. They're going to use their authority to carry out their opinion. And sometimes their opinion doesn't even line up with their party, and they become even more crazy, like we saw with Stalin. He doesn't really necessarily even agree with Marxism and Leninism. He carried out his own agenda even further than the obviously insane agenda of the communists, of the Soviets. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that deferring to politics to take care of any social problem, and deferring to politics to weed out dangerous people, whether they be another party or a gang or just some group like the KKK, you're just going to encourage them. You're going to encourage them to fight back. You're encouraging them to go vote and indirectly or directly commit violence against other people. And it's just going to be cyclical. Their enemies are going to gain political power, then they're going to gain political power, and it's just going to go back and forth. And believe me, this show is going to be a lot about history. I love history. I am not a historian, but I've studied a lot of it. And that's what happens. And it's always going to happen. One group of people is going to feel slighted. They're going to gain power. And then it's just going to reverse. And we've seen it over and over. So, to anyone watching this who might not be an anarchist, might not be a voluntarist, might not even be a libertarian, who's just watching it for the sake of, maybe you're against these fascist groups, but you are for government action against them, please don't be. Because, even Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, these supposedly moderate people still committing violence against others who disagree with them, who just happen to be born in the wrong place. And if you hate people and you commit violence against them, they had nothing to do with you, they just happen to be born in the wrong place and they disagree, but they're still subject to your rules. That's pretty much the definition of fascism. So, thank you for watching. Thanks to Mike Shanklin and everybody at Voluntary Virtues. I'll be here next week, Sunday at 3 o'clock, so be sure to check back in. I'll probably be talking about something a little bit less serious, so that's cool. Again, thanks for watching, and if you're not familiar with it, check out more stuff about Anarcho-Capitalism. And I'm glad. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks. See you next week.